There is a crack in the granite face of the ridge that looks from the outside like nothing at all. A shadow, a place where the mountain made a small mistake and then forgot about it. A person could walk the base of that ridge wall every day for a year and never stop to look twice. The stone closes above it. The stone closes below it. And from 50 feet away, it reads as just another vertical line in a surface full of vertical lines, the kind of detail the eye skips over because the eye is always looking for something more obvious. On a Tuesday morning in the early spring of 1889, three young women stood before that crack in the granite, and the oldest of them pressed her palm flat against the stone and held it there. Behind them, a dead trail, a cold sky the color of old pewter. No living soul who knew where they were. In front of them, darkness and the faint, impossible smell of pine smoke, rising from a place where no fire had any right to be. May Calloway was 20 years old. She had her father's hands wide across the knuckles, calloused in the places. That work makes its mark, and she had learned in the last 2 years to use them the way he had used his, without announcement, without waiting for permission. She pressed her palm against the granite and felt the cold of it move up through her wrist and into her arm, and she stood there for a long moment, not thinking, just feeling the mountain under her hand. Behind her, her sister Iris stood with the map open, not speaking. Beside Iris, their youngest sister June had her eyes on the darkness inside the crack. Her chin lifted slightly, her expression one that May had seen before, not quite wonder, not quite fear, something that lived between the two and could become either one, depending on what happened next. May looked at the crack. She looked at the darkness inside it. She looked at the thin curl of smoke that should not have been there. Then she picked up her pack, turned sideways, and went in. The town of Elk Creek sat in a fold of the Montana Territory Mountains. The way a coin sits at the bottom of a coat pocket, present useful in its way, but easy to forget about and hard to find when you needed it. It existed because the ground around it had once been worth something, and the people who arrived first had stayed, not because the ground kept being worth something, but because leaving felt too much like admitting they had been wrong to come. The Calloways had lived on the edge of it for 11 years, not quite in the town, not quite outside it. Elias Calloway had worked timber and traded lumber contracts with men in Helena who never set foot in Elk Creek, and Clara Calloway had kept a kitchen garden so productive that women twice her age came to ask what she put in the soil. The Calloways were respected in the way that frontier people respect someone they don't entirely understand at a careful distance, with a caution that looked like warmth if you didn't examine it too closely. May had grown up understanding that the family occupied a particular kind of position in Elk Creek. They were known without being known. They were trusted without being confided in. And when things went wrong, as things in Elk Creek regularly did, a bad winter, a failed claim, a family that quietly disappeared back east, the Calloways were the kind of people that other people were glad were there without ever quite being glad enough to help. She had understood this from a young age without being able to name it. She could name it now. Elias Calloway was a tall man with a deliberate way of moving, the kind of man who never seemed to hurry, but always arrived precisely when he meant to. He spoke less than most men and worked harder than almost all of them, and he had a habit in the evenings of sitting on the porch steps and looking at the mountains to the north, with an expression that May, as a child, had taken for contentment and had later come to think might have been something closer to intention. He disappeared into the high country regularly, 2 days, sometimes 3. He always said he was checking timber or scouting new growth, and no one had ever had a reason to question this, because Elias Calloway was a man who moved through the world with quiet purpose and questioning. That purpose would have felt like questioning the mountain itself. May had been 9 years old the first time he said it to her. They had been walking the lower ridge together on a Sunday morning, and she had asked him something she no longer remembered, what some child's question about shelter, about what made a safe place safe, and he had stopped walking and looked at her with that particular attention he sometimes gave things that mattered to him. The best shelter a person can have, he said, is one nobody else knows about. She had thought he meant it the way grown men sometimes talk, large and vague, and meaning nothing specific. She had filed it away in the place where children file things that don't yet make sense. She would not understand it for 11 years. She would not understand it until she was standing at that wall. Clara Calloway died in the winter of 1886. It was a fever, the kind that moved fast and didn't negotiate. She was sick on a Tuesday and gone by the following Sunday, and the speed of it was one of the things that made it worst. There was no time to prepare, no time to say the things that needed saying, no time for anything except being present and then being without her. May was 17. She had held the house together the way her mother would have wanted it, held practically without theater with her hands in the work before the grief had finished settling. She was not sure even now whether that had been the right thing or simply the only thing she knew how to do. Iris had been 15, and she had responded to their mother's death by becoming Iris more observant, more precise, more given to sitting quietly with her small journal pressed open against her knee and writing things down in the small, careful hand that looked nothing like a 15-year-old's handwriting. She observed the world the way a surveyor observes a landscape, systematically noting what was there, without yet concluding what it meant. June had been 13, and June had cried in the open way that May had always envied her for, completely without apology, the way the very young can cry before the world teaches them that grief is something to be managed rather than felt. June was the one most likely to reach out and touch something beautiful or strange. She was the one most likely to ask the question nobody else had thought to ask. She was, of all three of them, the one most like Clara, not in appearance but in the quality of her attention, the way she noticed things growing. After Clara's death, Elias had continued his trips into the high country. If anything, he went more often. May, managing the household with the focused attention of someone who has decided that management is a form of survival, had not thought much about this. Her father was a man who processed things through action rather than speech. It seemed natural that loss would send him out into the work he loved. She understood now that she had been right about that, but wrong about what the work was. Elias Calloway died in the late spring of 1888. He fell from a section of the northern ridge that he had walked by May's estimation not fewer than 100 times. The ground gave way, or his footing did, and he went down a slope of loose granite and did not come back up. It was Silas Webb who found him. Silas was a trapper who moved through the mountain valleys on a regular circuit 10 days out and back, a lean man with a face like weathered pine and a habit of appearing at inconvenient moments without announcement. He had known Elias Calloway for years. He had come to May's door with his hat in his hands and his expression already telling her the news before his mouth opened to say it. May was 20. She had stood in the doorway and listened to Silas Webb tell her where her father's body had come to rest, and she had thanked him in a voice that did not shake, and she had closed the door and stood with her back against it in the empty kitchen for a long time before she went to find her sisters. She did not understand then what she came to understand much later, that her father had died on that section of the northern ridge because he had been working there, not checking timber, not scouting, working, cutting and carrying and fitting stone into a passage through a granite wall, completing the last piece of something he had been building for years, something he had not told anyone about, something he had made in secret out of love and foresight, in the particular fear of a man who has looked at the world and seen clearly what it is capable of. He had died finishing it. He had died, in other words, for the same reason and in the same spirit as everything else he had ever done for his daughters, quietly, completely, and without asking for credit. The letter came from the bottom of his trunk, sealed with candle wax and addressed in Elias's careful, unhurried handwriting, for May, Iris, and June, when the time comes. May found it 6 days after Denton Marsh came to the house. Marsh owned the property the Calloways rented. He was not a cruel man. May had always been clear-eyed about that, but he was a practical one, and his practicality had the particular quality that costs other people everything. He had attended Elias Calloway's burial with an expression of genuine regret. He had waited a respectful 2 weeks before coming to the door, and then he had explained in the same tone he might use to describe a change in weather that he needed the property back by the end of the month. May had thanked him. She had closed the door. She had stood in the empty kitchen again. It was becoming a habit, and she had understood with complete clarity that no one in Elk Creek was going to help them. Not from cruelty, simply from the arithmetic of frontier life, where everyone had enough difficulty of their own, and the presence of 3 young women without parents was a problem that would need to be solved by someone else's hand. She went through her father's things that evening systematically, the way he had taught her to do any task that needed doing from the beginning without skipping. The trunk was at the back of the bedroom he had occupied alone for the last 3 years. Inside, work clothes folded with his characteristic precision. A tin of tobacco he had given up sometime the previous year. A small box of letters from Helena Timber correspondence. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a sealed envelope with their names on it in that careful particular hand. May carried it to the kitchen table without opening it. She called her sisters. Iris came first, her journal under her arm, out of habit, her eyes already moving to the envelope on the table. June came from the garden. She had been in the garden every afternoon since their father's burial, tending Clara's beds with the focused attention of grief redirected, and she came inside still carrying her trowel and sat down without putting it away. May broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages written in ink on both sides, the handwriting the same throughout, unhurried, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who was not in a hurry because he had thought this through and knew what he needed to say. The first page was Elias Calloway telling his daughters that he loved them. He did it the way he had always done, everything plainly, without decoration, without the kind of language that tries to make love larger than it is by dressing it up. He named each of them. He said what he saw in each of them. He said it once and did not repeat it. The second page was practical. There was a small amount of money held with a man at the Helena land office, enough to outfit them for several weeks of travel and some beyond. He named the man and gave the address. He explained how to access it. The third page was directions. Distances, landmarks, a hand-drawn map of a trail that left the main road 7 miles north of Elk Creek and climbed into the granite ridges above the tree line. The map was drawn with the same precision as everything else Elias Calloway had ever done. Distances, marked landmarks, noted the contours of the trail rendered in careful pencil lines that showed exactly the mind of a man who had walked this route many times in all kinds of light. At the bottom below the map, below the last set of directions, in the same unhurried ink, I made you something. Go find it. May read this twice. Then she turned the page over, because her father's letters always said more than they seemed to at first, and they're faint in pencil, the kind of mark that could only be read by tilting the paper toward the candlelight, was a final line. The claim is filed. 3 names. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. June was the first to speak. She looked at the map for a long time, then she looked up. He drew this himself, Iris said before June could form the question. She was leaning over the table, her finger tracing the pencil lines. Look at the precision. He knew every step of this trail. He went up there, June said. All those times he said he was checking timber. May set the letter down on the table. She looked at her sisters. She looked at the map. We have nowhere else, she said. That was the truth in its plainest form. Denton Marsh had given them until the end of the month. They had no relatives within any practical distance. The families of Elk Creek were not unkind, but they were not in a position to absorb 3 extra mouths, and May had already seen on several faces the particular expression that means I wish I could do more, and also means I won't. Iris spread the map flat with both hands. She studied it for a long moment, the way she studied anything that carried information carefully, completely, without rushing toward a conclusion. 7 miles north from the main road, and she said, then left at a granite pillar he's marked here. 2 more miles up. He says the trail disappears, but to keep going northeast. She looked at the bottom of the map. He says we'll know the wall when we see it. What if it's nothing? June asked. She asked it the way she asked every question, not with doubt, but with genuine openness, as though she wanted to know the answer, whatever it turned out to be. Then we went for a walk, May said. With everything we own on our backs, Iris said. But she said it without bitterness. She was already thinking through the logistics. May could see it in her face, that inward calculation that was Iris's particular talent, the ability to look at a problem and begin quietly and without announcement to take it apart. May lay awake that night for a long time. She looked at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with her sisters since their mother's death, and she thought about what it meant to follow a dead man's directions into the mountains with 2 younger sisters in her care. She thought about what it meant to trust someone after they were gone. She thought about Elias Calloway disappearing into the high country on those long trips, coming back quieter than he had left, smelling of cut timber and granite dust, and something else she had never been able to name. She thought about the penciled line at the bottom of the page. The claim is filed. 3 names he had known, he had planned. He had done it all without saying a word about it, without asking for help, without making it anyone else's concern. This was, she reflected, the most Elias Callaway things she had ever encountered, and she had spent 20 years encountering Elias Callaway things. By morning, she had decided they would go. They would see what he had made. And whatever it was, shelter or ruin, or simply a place he had loved, they would face it the way he had raised them to face things with their hands in the work, without looking back at what they had left behind. They packed for 3 days and left before dawn on a Tuesday. May carried the frame pack with the tools and dry goods, an axe, a handsaw, 2 coils of rope, matches, salt pork, dried beans, a tin of coffee that had cost more than she would have liked. Iris carried the bedrolls and their father's letter folded inside her journal, which she carried everywhere and which contained, May suspected, a far more accurate accounting of their family's recent history than anyone outside this house had any idea existed. June carried the tin box from the kitchen shelf. May had noticed it in June's hands when they gathered at the door in the gray pre-dawn, and she had understood immediately what it was, the tin where Clara Callaway had kept her seed stock sorted and labeled in her particular careful way, the heritage varieties she had grown for years and traded with other gardeners in the territory, things she had cultivated and preserved and treated with the seriousness of someone who understood that certain kinds of knowledge once lost do not come back. Neither May nor Iris said a word about the tin. June held it against her chest with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has made a decision that doesn't require discussion, and they walked out into the cold, early dark without looking back at the house. The road north of Elk Creek was empty. The mountains ahead were dark against a sky that had not yet decided what color it was going to be. Not black, not gray, something in between that belonged to the specific hour before dawn, when the world is suspended between what it was and what it's about to become. They walked into it. May set the pace steady, not fast, conserving what would be needed for the climb. Iris walked behind her with the map case under one arm and that characteristic expression of focused attention, reading the landscape as they moved through it, the way she read everything systematically, building a picture from parts. June walked last, and May could hear her occasionally not speaking, just present the small sounds of her boots on the road, and once, when a deer crossed the trail ahead of them in the half-dark, a soft sound that was not quite a word. 2 miles into the climb, June found the wood. May heard her stop and turned back to see her sister crouching at the base of a pine tree, reaching into the root system, where something had been wedged, a piece of cut timber, old and weathered, but cut with a saw, not broken. The cut was clean and deliberate. Iris crouched beside June. She turned the piece over. On the underside, in pencil lines, faded but legible, E.C. Elias Callaway. No one spoke for a moment. June pressed her fingers over the letters the way she sometimes pressed her hand over something she wanted to memorize, as though the information could pass through the skin. "He was here," she said. "He was working." Iris said quietly. She was looking at the cut end of the timber, the precision of the saw line. May looked up the trail. She thought of her father on the slope before dawn carrying timber through the trees with no one watching. She thought of how many times she had seen him leave and not thought to wonder where exactly he was going. "He was building," she said. "Let's go see what." The granite pillar was exactly where the map said it would be. It stood apart from the ridge wall like a sentinel, a column of pale rock, separate, deliberate seeming, the kind of formation that could make a person believe the land had intentions. They turned left at it, and the trail disappeared almost immediately, just as the letter had warned, dissolving into loose rock and low scrub pine that offered no clear path and no obvious way forward. Iris navigated with the map open in her hands, calling direction adjustments to May, who led them through the thinning trees. Northeast. Keep northeast. The ridge wall rose to their right, gray and ancient, striped with old watermarks. May saw the entrance before she understood what she was seeing. At first it read as just another shadow, one of a dozen vertical shadows in the face of the granite. Then she noticed that it didn't move. The morning light was shifting as clouds passed overhead, and every other shadow on the wall shifted with it, but this one stayed dark, stayed the same, as if the darkness inside it were its own thing, independent of the light outside. She stopped walking. The crack ran from the ground to a height of perhaps 8 feet, where the stone closed again above it. At its widest point, May estimated 18 inches. The edges, she moved closer and looked, were worn smooth in a way that the rest of the wall was not. Not weather smooth, smooth by passage. Someone had moved through this opening enough times to polish the stone. She looked at her sisters. Iris was looking at the map, then at the wall, then at the map again. Her expression, the one she wore when something confirmed what she had already calculated. June was looking at the opening with both hands at her sides and her chin slightly lifted. "Papa?" June breathed. The word was barely sound. May set her pack down against the wall. She leaned into the opening. Cool air pushed against her face from inside, not the dead cold of a sealed space, but something more temperate, like the air inside a root cellar in autumn. Moving air almost, as though the space beyond was large enough to have its own weather. She could see nothing past the first few feet, just stone and shadow and the faint, persistent smell of pine smoke that had no explanation. She picked up her pack. She turned sideways. She went in. The passage was 12 feet long. She moved through it with her pack, scraping both walls. Her boots finding solid footing on a floor that was not natural. She could feel even through her boot soles that the stone beneath her was flat in a way that granite does not flatten itself. It had been leveled. Stones had been laid in a deliberate pattern to create a walkable surface. She looked down in the dimness and could make out the edges of the laid stones fitted together with the same care she had seen in every piece of her father's work. He had leveled the path. He had thought about someone walking through here in the dark carrying things, and he had leveled the path so they wouldn't stumble. She kept moving, and then the passage opened. She had expected a cave. She had been bracing herself for the particular disappointment of a cave, a natural hollow, interesting in its way, meaningful in its way, but ultimately just a hole in a mountain, a refuge of last resort. What she stepped into was not a cave. It was a chamber. Roughly oval, perhaps 40 feet across at its widest point, and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose in a natural granite arch to perhaps 20 feet at the center. The walls were irregular, but not jagged granite that had fractured along its own lines and left surfaces that were massive and varied, but not hostile. And through the ceiling, through the fissures in the rock above, came shafts of pale morning light. They fell in angled columns across the stone floor. 4 of them, 5 moving slightly, as the clouds outside moved shifting and adjusting, filling the chamber with a cool blue-white illumination that was not sunlight exactly, but was not darkness either. Something in between, something that belonged specifically to this place. May stood very still. Against the far wall, the north wall she estimated, stood the cabin. It was small, 16 feet by 14 perhaps, built directly against the granite, using the chamber wall as its rear wall. The timber was hand-cut and fitted with a precision that she recognized immediately, and in her chest, not in her eyes, the particular precision of her father's carpentry, the care he took with joints and angles. The way he had always said that a poorly fitted joint was a lie in the structure that would cost you later. The roof was split shingles, slightly mossy at the edges. A door hung slightly ajar on iron hinges. A single window opening, shuttered from inside, faced the chamber floor. A tin stovepipe rose from the roof and disappeared into a fissure in the stone above. May stood in the center of the chamber floor and looked at it. Behind her, she heard the sound of Iris coming through the passage, the soft scrape of pack against stone, then the slight acceleration of breath that happens when a body moves from constriction into open space, and then the silence of someone who has stopped moving because what they are seeing has stopped them. And then June coming through after, and the small sound she made, not a word, not a cry, something that had no category, something that belonged to the specific experience of finding that the world is capable of something you had not known to expect from it. He built a house, June said. Her voice was steady and wondering at once. Inside the mountain. May walked to the cabin and put her hand on the door frame. The wood was dry, solid, no give, no rot, no uncertainty in the grain. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. One room. A plank floor laid with the same careful precision as the passage stone's level fitted the kind of floor that would last. A small iron stove with its pipe running up through the roof shingles. A wooden shelf along one wall. A sleeping platform built into the corner, wide enough for 3. A small table with 2 chairs. Everything was dusty, with the particular dust of a space unused, but not abandoned the months since her father had last been here. But intact, complete, as though someone had simply stepped out and intended to return. A tin cup sat on the table. May looked at it for a long moment. Just a tin cup on a table in a room inside a mountain. The ordinary persistence of it, the way it sat there as though waiting. On the shelf, she found a folded piece of cloth. She picked it up and shook it gently and understood what she was holding, a curtain, she realized. Cut and hemmed for the window, hemmed with straight, careful stitches, never hung. Her father had cut and hemmed a curtain for the window of this cabin inside a mountain, and he had not lived to hang it. Iris appeared in the doorway. Then June, who stopped on the threshold with both hands pressed against her mouth and stood there looking at the cup on the table and the curtain in May's hands and the careful plank floor their father had laid in the dark of a granite chamber for daughters he would not live to see arrive. They cried. There was no managing it, and none of them tried. June sat down on the sleeping platform and cried completely, without restraint, the way she had cried when their father died, as though grief were a country you had to pass through fully to get to the other side of it. Iris stood in the center of the room and let the tears come without wiping them. Her journal clutched against her chest, her face utterly still in the way it was still only when something had moved her past the reach of calculation. May stood by the window and pressed her knuckles against her lips and looked at the curtain in her hand. She was the last to cry, and the one who cried the longest. When they were done, they got to work. May had been raised to understand that grief moves best when it moves into the hands. Clara had said something like this once, not in those exact words, but in the same direction, and May had not understood it then. She understood it now. She shook the curtain out and found already in place at the window frame 2 small nails set at exactly the right height. Her father had placed them there. He had measured the curtain and placed the nails and left it for someone else to hang, because he had understood even then that he might not be the one to hang it. May put the curtain on the nails and stepped back and looked at it. Iris went directly to the shelf and began cataloging what was stored there. A paper of salt wrapped tight against moisture. A tin of lard gone solid with age but still sealed. Dried herbs in bundles tied with cord. She lifted one to her nose and then stood with her eyes closed for a moment. 3 folded Hessian sacks. A small box of tallow candles. A coil of heavy thread. A whetstone. Not nothing. Not nearly nothing. A start carefully assembled and left to be found. June had gone out of the cabin while May and Iris were working, and May heard. Heard the sound of her moving along the chamber wall beyond the cabin, following something May hadn't noticed yet. Then June's hand on May's arm pulling without speaking. May followed her around the corner of the cabin's outer wall to where a natural shelf of stone jutted from the chamber wall. Above it, running along a seam in the granite, was a thin trickle of water, steady, slow, collecting in a basin that had been shaped into the stone shelf. Not shaped by water, shaped by tools. May looked at the edges of the basin, regular, deliberate, chisel marks in the granite, small and precise and patient, the marks of work done in the dark over many hours or days. She reached out and touched the water collecting in the basin. Warm. Not hot warm the way water gets when it has traveled a long way through rock that holds heat from somewhere deep below the surface. June touched it after her. Then she looked up at May with an expression that May would remember for the rest of her life, not surprise exactly, but something she might call confirmation. As though June had suspected the world was capable of something like this and was now being proven right. Thermal seam, Iris said, coming around the corner and crouching over the basin. She traced the chisel marks with one finger without touching them. There's a heat source below. He found it and shaped the basin to catch the water before it spread. She looked at the stone. He worked this himself. Look at the consistency of these marks. Hours of work, careful work. May looked at the marks, small, deliberate. The marks of a man working alone in the dark of a granite chamber, cutting a basin into stone with a chisel and a steady hand so that someday there would be warm water available to the people he loved in a place where nothing warm had any right to exist. There's soil, June said. She was already moving further along the chamber wall, past the water basin to a place where the trickle had been finding its way along the base of the stone over years and leaving behind it a band of dark, damp earth. May followed. The band was perhaps 18 inches wide, running for nearly 20 feet along the wall in the warmest part of the chamber, directly across from the ceiling fissures that let in the most light. June crouched and pressed her palm flat into the earth. She held it there the way May had held her hand against the granite outside, feeling it, reading it. It's good, she said. Warm, damp, but not wet. She looked at her sisters. She already had her hand moving toward the tin box in her coat pocket, Clara's seeds. Not yet, May said gently. First, we make the cabin livable, then we plant. June looked at the soil for one more moment. Then she stood up and nodded, and they went back to work. They worked all that day and into the afternoon. The light in the chamber shifted as the sun moved outside the columns from the ceiling, fissures changing angle tracking slowly across the stone floor, like the hands of a clock that told a different kind of time than the clocks in Elk Creek. May found this unexpectedly the most disorienting thing about the place, not the silence, not the stone, but the way time moved differently here, marked by light and not by the sounds of a town going about its business. She cut a proper broom from scrub growth at the entrance of the passage. She swept the cabin floor twice, raising a dust that settled slowly in the still air. She checked the stove, the flue was clear, the iron sound, and laid a fire from the wood stacked against the chamber wall. Her father had left it there split and ready enough for weeks, dried to the point where it would catch easily. She held a match to the kindling and watched the fire take, then watched the smoke rise up through the pipe and disappear into the fissure above. Gone. Clean. As though the mountain were breathing. Iris redirected the water flow from the basin using a wedge of flat stone she worked into place with the patient precision that May associated with her at her best. Not fast, but exactly right, directing the overflow to a lower shelf where it could collect for washing. She tested the redirection 3 times before she was satisfied. June, once May gave the word, went to the soil ban with their mother's tin and knelt there in the cool blue light of the chamber and began to work. She had watched Clara garden for 16 years. She had the knowledge in her hands the way some knowledge only lives in the hands, not in the mind, not in words, but in the particular pressure of fingers in soil, in the angle of a seed going into the earth, and the depth of a furrow made with an index finger pressed into the second knuckle. She worked the soil with wood ash from the stove that May brought her. She planted in careful rows, pressed each seed in with her forefinger, covered them without packing the earth too tight. She marked each row with a flat stone and a nick to indicate what was planted. Radishes, hardy greens, their mother's kitchen herbs, the ones Clara had grown every year of her married life, the ones that smelled when you crushed a leaf between your fingers of every kitchen the family had ever stood in together. May watched her work and felt something shift in her chest. Not grief, not its opposite. Something that lived between them like a space that had been empty for a long time and was just beginning, slowly and without announcement, to fill. By evening, the cabin was warm. The curtain hung at the window. The shelves held their goods sorted and organized in Iris's particular way, everything in a place it could be found again. 3 bedrolls lay on the sleeping platform side by side, each in the position that had always been each sister's position without anyone ever deciding it. Outside in the chamber, the mineral water dripped steadily into its basin. The soil waited in its warm, dark band along the wall. After supper, salt pork beans, coffee from a pot set on the iron stove, Iris opened her journal and began writing. Not the journal she had brought from Elk Creek, the one from the shelf, the one their father had left there. She had opened it without ceremony and turned to the first page, and May had watched her do it and said nothing. June fell asleep quickly, her hands still faintly soiled from the planting. Her expression in sleep, the expression of someone who has finished something they wanted to finish. May sat by the stove and listened to the faint settling of stone that old granite makes when temperature changes, to the steady drip of warm water, to the distant sound of wind that moved somewhere above and outside and could not reach them here, to her sister's breathing. She thought about the penciled line at the bottom of the last page of her father's letter. The claim is filed. 3 names. She thought about him sitting somewhere, maybe here, maybe in this cabin, by this stove, writing that line in pencil instead of ink, not because it was less certain, but because it was the kind of certainty that lived in a different register than the words around it, the kind that needed to be found, not handed over. She thought about what it meant, that he had been afraid enough long enough ago to file a land claim in 3 children's names when the oldest of those children was 12 years old. She thought about the heft of what he had built here. Not just the cabin, not just the basin, not just the leveled passage floor. All of it, the whole shape of it, the years of it, and then she stopped thinking and just sat with the warmth of the stove and the sound of the mountain around her and the 2 people she loved most in the world breathing quietly on either side of her, and she understood for the first time and completely what her father had been trying to give them. Not just shelter, not just stone and timber and warm water. a position from which to begin. Then she went back under the sleeping platform and reached into the space where she had noticed that first afternoon, a gap in the planking that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. She pressed her fingers into the gap and lifted. A panel came up, hinged at the back, lifting from the front, her father's work invisible unless you knew to look. In the space below, a box of dark wood the size of a bread loaf fitted with a simple hasp. May set the panel aside and lifted the box up to the light of the stove. She set it on the table. Iris had put down the journal. June had woken silently and was sitting up on the platform watching. May opened the hasp and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped individually in pieces of cloth, 3 separate bundles tied with cord, each one a different size. She lifted the largest one first, unwrapped it, felt the leather of the handle before she saw it, a nice short-bladed, the kind used for fine work rather than rough labor, and on the handle in small, careful letters that must have taken real effort to cut into the wood. May. She set it down and could not speak. Iris reached forward and took the middle bundle, unwrapped it. A book? No, not a book, a blank journal, the cover made of worked leather, the pages clean and waiting. She opened the front cover. Nothing inside, but on the inside of the back cover in pencil, barely visible, for what you notice. June took the smallest bundle herself, unwrapped it slowly, a cloth pouch, drawstring tied. She opened it and looked inside and held it for a moment without speaking. Then she reached into her coat and took out Clara's tin and set it beside the pouch and looked at them both. They're the same, she said. May looked. The seeds in the pouch were the same varieties as the ones in Clara's tin, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. The same labels in the same categories, sorted the same way. Tucked into the pouch's drawstring was a small, folded piece of paper. June opened it. She read it once. Then she looked up. "What does it say?" Iris asked. June turned the paper so they could see it. The handwriting was their father's. The message was 4 words. "Your mother showed me which ones." May pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at that paper and understood that her father had stood in Clara's garden in the last months of her life and asked his wife, who was dying, who must have known she was dying, to teach him which seeds to save and how to save them. And Clara had taught him, and he had carried that knowledge up into these mountains and pressed it into pouches and wrapped them in cloth and put them in a box under a floor to be found by a 16-year-old girl who had her mother's hands and her mother's eyes and her mother's particular understanding of what it means to put a seed in the ground and trust that something will come of it. 3 years. He had carried that knowledge for 3 years and said nothing about it to anyone. They cried again. Differently this time, not the ragged grief of the first hours, but something quieter and more permanent, the kind of tears that come when you understand not just that someone loved you, but the specific shape and dimension of that love, how far it reached, and how long it had been reaching. When they were done, May put the knife in her belt. Iris put the journal on the shelf beside the one she had brought from Elk Creek. June tied the seed pouch to her coat alongside Clara's tin and pressed both against her chest for a moment before letting go. Outside, the mountain was quiet. The water dripped. The light had gone from the fissures above, replaced by a deeper dark, and that was not frightening, but simply the dark of a safe place at night, the particular dark of a roof over your head and walls around you, and warmth at the center. May banked the fire in the stove. She listened to her sister's breathing settle into sleep. She sat with her back against the wall her father had built and looked at the dark where the warm soil waited, and the seeds were already beginning at whatever depth seeds begin the slow, irreversible work of becoming. She thought of him saying it to her on the lower ridge when she was 9 years old. The best shelter a person can have is one nobody else knows about. She had thought he meant hiding. She had thought for 11 years that he meant concealment, the strategy of disappearance, the safety of not being found. She understood now what he had actually meant. He had not meant hide yourself away and hope the world forgets you exist. He had meant build something real, build it carefully, build it in a place that belongs to you and make it strong enough that when the world comes, and the world always comes, you are standing on ground that is already yours. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved somewhere above the ridge, high and cold, and belonging entirely to the open air. Here inside the mountain there was no wind. There was only the fire and the water, and the dark, and her sisters, and the long patient work of their father's hands surrounding them on every side. They were not safe forever. She knew that. Nothing in this life is safe forever. There would be difficulty ahead. She could feel the shape of it already, the way you feel weather coming, in the quality of the air before the clouds arrive. The world outside this mountain did not know where they were, but the world outside this mountain was not finished with them. But tonight they were safe. Tonight they had a place that was theirs, built by hands, that had loved them on ground, that bore their names in a chamber that the mountain had been keeping without knowing it for exactly this purpose. That was enough to begin. The first 2 weeks inside the mountain had their own rhythm, and it was nothing like the rhythm of Elk Creek. In Elk Creek, time was measured by other people, by the sound of the mill starting up in the morning and the sound of it stopping at dusk, by the stage that came through on Thursdays and the post that came with it, by the way the town collectively noted who was seen where and with whom and drew its small, precise conclusions. Time in Elk Creek was a communal thing, shared whether you wanted to share it or not. Time inside the mountain was different. It was measured by light, the slow arrival of the morning columns through the ceiling fissures, the way they tracked across the chamber floor through the middle hours, the way they faded and went gray and disappeared in the evening, leaving behind a dark that was complete and specific and belonged entirely to this place. It was measured by the drip of warm water into the stone basin and the hiss of the iron stove and the small sounds of three people living in close quarters with purpose. May woke before her sisters every morning, as she always had. She added wood to the stove and made coffee and stood at the cabin door, looking out at the chamber in the early dark before the light came through the fissures, and she took stock. Not of problems she had learned from her father that taking stock of problems before the day has properly started is a way of doubling them. She took stock of what was there, what was solid, what was working, what needed attention. The answers in those first 2 weeks were mostly good. The cabin was sound. The stove drew well. The passage through the granite was passable in both directions and could be concealed from the outside by repositioning the boulder Elias had placed there large enough to block the view of the entrance, small enough that May could roll it with effort. The water from the thermal seam was consistent and clean. The wood supply against the chamber wall would last, by May's estimation, 6 weeks before they would need to think about supplementing it. They fell into the division of labor the way water falls into channels, not because anyone decided it, but because the shape of the ground made certain paths natural. May handled the perimeter. Every morning before the light came properly through the fissures, she went out through the passage and walked the base of the ridge wall for a 1/4 mile in each direction, reading the ground the way her father had taught her to read it, looking for tracks in the loose stone at the base of the wall, looking for disturbances in the scrub pine, looking for evidence that someone else had been moving in this section of the ridge, and if so, in what direction and with what purpose. She found nothing in those first 2 weeks. Nothing except the mountain doing what the mountain did, shined, rocked the occasional deer print in the damp soil at the base of the pine trees. She was not yet worried, but she was paying attention. Iris handled the paperwork. She had spread their father's documents on the table the second morning the land claim filing the survey description, the letter from his contact at the Helena land office, and she had studied them with the systematic focus she brought to anything that contained information. By the end of the first day of study, she had produced a summary in her clear, precise handwriting, organized by date, that laid out exactly what Elias Calloway had filed and when and under what legal framework. It was, May thought, looking over her sister's shoulder, more thorough than anything the Elk Creek land office had ever seen. The claim had been filed in 1881 under Iris's careful notation, mineral and timber rights, Northeastern Granite Ridge Section survey pending. 3 names listed as holders. The survey had never been completed, which left the claim in a particular kind of legal ambiguity, real but unresolved, present but not yet fully defined. The kind of ambiguity that certain kinds of men knew how to navigate. "There's something else," Iris said on the 3rd evening. May looked up from the axe handle she was examining for cracks. Iris had the original filing papers in one hand and a page she had found folded inside them in the other. She set them side by side on the table. "He filed the original claim in 1881, she said. "Mineral and timber rights, 3 names ours." She touched the first document. Then in 1886 he added an amendment. She touched the second page. He went back to the land office and added language. She pointed to a section near the bottom of the amendment page. Occupied structure, permanent domicile, as of the date of filing. May looked at the language. It was precise, deliberately precise. He built the cabin before he filed the amendment, Iris said. The amendment references an existing structure. He built it first, then filed the paperwork to make the occupancy official. She looked up. This changes what we have. It's not just a mineral claim, it's an occupancy claim. And an occupancy claim is much harder to challenge than a mineral claim because it requires proof of displacement. The challenger has to prove that we were never legitimately here, and we were. We are. She paused. He was. May thought about 1886, the year their mother died. Elias disappearing into the mountains more frequently in the months after Clara's death, coming back quieter each time. He did this right after she died, May said. Yes. He came up here, May said slowly, working it out. And he finished enough of the cabin to make the occupancy language legal, and then he went to the land office and amended the filing. She looked at her sister. He knew after she died that things had changed, that the risk had increased. He knew that he was the only thing standing between us and exactly what happened, Iris said, and he started planning for the possibility that he might not be standing there much longer. The iron stove ticked in the silence that followed. Outside, the water dripped into its basin. May picked up the axe handle and turned it in her hands and said nothing for a while. He was thorough, she said finally. He was terrified, Iris said, not unkindly, and thorough. June in those first 2 weeks had been working the soil. She had prepared the earth along the warm wall the way Clara had always prepared, ground for planting, slowly with full attention, treating the preparation as seriously as the planting itself. She had worked wood ash from the stove into the soil each morning, a thin, even layer turned in with her hands rather than a tool, because she said she could feel better that way whether the texture was right. She had tested the warmth of the soil at different points along the band, pressing her palm flat at intervals, finding where the thermal influence was strongest, and mapping the growing area accordingly. When she was satisfied with the preparation on the 5th day, she planted. She used seeds from both sources, Clara's tin and the pouch from their father's box. She planted them side by side in the careful rows she had marked out, pressing each seed in at the depth her mother had taught her, spacing them with the instinct of someone who had been watching this done since before she could walk. She marked each row with a flat stone and a nick, the notation system she had invented on the day of planting and maintained with the consistency of a record keeper. Radishes in the warmest section, closest to the thermal seam. Hardy greens in the middle band where the light from the fissures fell most directly. The kitchen herbs along the outer edge where the soil was slightly cooler and the light more diffuse. May had come around the corner of the cabin on the 6th morning to find June lying flat on the chamber floor with her face 6 inches from the soil looking at something. What are you doing? May asked. Watching, June said without moving. For what? The first one, June said. It'll be the radishes. I want to see which row comes up first. May had stood there for a moment looking at her youngest sister lying on the stone floor of a granite chamber in the mountains of Montana, watching the earth for the first signs of life, with the focused patience of someone who understood that certain kinds of knowledge only come to those who are willing to wait for them. She had thought of Clara. She had gone back to work. On the 11th day, May heard the footsteps above the chamber. She was outside the passage entrance in the narrow space between the boulder and the wall, gathering pine needles for the cabin floor. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray on the granite, the air carrying the particular cold of an altitude where spring arrives reluctantly and without warmth. She heard them first as a change in the quality of the silence, not the sound itself, but the absence of the sound that had been there before. The wind in the upper pines, the small movements of the mountain doing its work. Then the sound itself arrived, boots on loose granite, careful and deliberate, moving along the ridge face above and to her left. May went still, completely still. She pressed herself back against the wall of the ridge, into the shadow between the boulder and the stone, and she stopped. Everything stopped moving, stopped the sound of her own breathing as much as a person can stop it, and she listened. The steps moved. They were not random. They were not the stumbling progress of a lost traveler or the quick light steps of a hunter following game. They were methodical. They moved a section, paused, moved again. The pause was the tell. It was the pause of someone looking, not walking. Someone working the ridge wall systematically from above. May counted her breaths. In through the nose, slow all the way down, and out the same way. She made herself small and still against the granite, and she did not move. The steps came closer. She could hear them more clearly now. The crunch of boot on loose stone, the occasional small slide of a pebble dislodged the silence of the pauses in between. Whoever it was, they were perhaps 20 feet above her and moving along the top of the ridge in her direction. She did not look up. Looking up meant moving her face, and moving her face meant the possibility, however slight, of catching light. She looked at the ground in front of her and breathed and waited. The steps reached a point directly above. Paused longer than the other pauses, longer than any pause she had counted so far. May held completely still and thought of nothing, because thinking produced its own quality of presence, and she did not want to be present at this moment in any way that could be detected. Then the steps moved on, continued along the ridge face, grew quieter, faded. She stood in the shadow and did not move for another 10 minutes. Then she rolled the boulder back into place, went through the passage, and pulled the interior canvas across the entrance behind her. She told her sisters that evening by firelight, without raising her voice or changing her tone, because the worst thing about bad news, her father had always said, is the way you say it. Iris was quiet through the full account. When May finished, she said, "How close to the entrance? 20 feet. Perhaps less. Did they see you?" "I was in the shadow of the wall. I don't believe so." Iris looked at the canvas covering the passage entrance. Then she looked at her journal open on the table. Then she looked at May with the expression she wore when she had already begun working on a problem and needed to say it aloud to finish it. "Can we improve the concealment?" June asked. She was looking at the boulder the way she looked at soil, as something that could be worked and adjusted, made more productive. "The boulder placement is good," May said, "but the area around it looks tended. The ground near the entrance is too clear. Someone who knew what they were looking for could read it." "Foot traffic," Iris said. "Yes, we need to dress the area, scatter debris, make it look like the wall has been undisturbed for years." "We do that," June said. "Tomorrow morning, early before there's any light." May nodded. Then as she looked at Iris, because Iris had been quiet in the specific way she was quiet when she had not finished thinking. "The claim," Iris said, "we need to register our occupancy formally. The amendment exists, but it was filed by our father. We need documentation that we are here, now, that we have been here since a specific date." She paused. "If someone is already looking for us, we need to move faster than they can." "We can't go to the Elk Creek land office," May said. "Going there draws attention to where we are." "No," Iris agreed, "but I can write a letter." She opened the journal to a clean page. "There's a circuit lawyer our father used for timber contracts. Edgar Finch, he comes through the territory on a regular schedule. If I write to him through the postal agent in the next valley, not through Elk Creek, not through anywhere that connects us to this location," she looked up, "we stay invisible, while the claim gets formally recorded." May looked at her sister for a long moment. "When did you think of this?" she asked. "About 3 minutes after you told us about the footsteps," Iris said. "The letter went out with Silas Webb. Silas came through the valley below the ridge on a circuit of 10 days, moving between his trap lines and the small trading post in the next valley over. And he had known Elias Calloway in the easy way, that people who move through the same country come to know each other without close friendship, but with the particular trust of people who understand each other's way of being in the world. May had gone down to the valley floor on the 4th day, before she had heard the footsteps, just to establish the contact she knew they would eventually need. She had found him at the spot Elias had mentioned in conversation years ago, a flat rock at the bend in the creek where Silas habitually made his noon camp. She had explained what she needed, not the full truth, but enough of it, that she and her sisters were staying on the ridge, that they needed letters to move through the next valley, not through Elk Creek, that they needed discretion. Silas had looked at her for a long moment with his weathered, unhurried face, and then he had said, "Your father was a fair man." "Yes," May said. "All right then," Silas said. She had paid him from the small store of money their father had left, or tried to. He had looked at the coin in her hand and then looked away from it, and she had understood that money was not what would work with Silas Webb. She went back up the ridge and came back with one of the jars of pickled herbs from the cabin shelf. Something Elias had put up himself, and Silas had taken that with a satisfaction that told her she had read him correctly. The letter went out with him 2 days later. Iris had written it in the voice of a legal correspondent, formal, specific, carefully worded, addressed to Edgar Finch at his last known location, routed through the postal agent in Millhaven, the valley to the east. The letter enclosed a copy of the relevant sections of the land claim, the text of the occupancy amendment, and a formal statement of residency signed by all three sisters and dated the first day they had entered the chamber. They waited. The boy appeared on the lower trail 7 days after the letter went out. May saw him from the ridge above. She had taken to making a morning circuit of the higher ground, as well as the base, working up through the scrub pine to a vantage point where she could see the approaches to the ridge from the south. The boy was perhaps 12, moving along the base of the lower trail with the particular wandering gait of a child who has been sent somewhere and told to look around without being told exactly what he is looking for. He walked the trail for perhaps half a mile. He looked at the ridge wall with the incurious gaze of a child performing an errand he doesn't understand. He picked up a stone and turned it over and put it down. He stood still for a moment at the point on the trail that was closest to the section of wall where the passage entrance was, and he looked at that section of wall with no particular expression. Then he turned and went back down the trail toward the valley. May stayed on the ridge until he was below the tree line. Then she went back down to the chamber entrance and through the passage and into the cabin where Iris was at the table with the claim documents, and June was at the wall doing something to the soil that involved a small stick in a measuring motion that May didn't interrupt. "A boy," May said, at 12 maybe, walking the lower trail. Iris set down her pen. "Not hunting," May said, "not wandering, moving with purpose but pretending not to." She sat down in the second chair. Someone pointed him in a direction and told him to see what was there. Iris was quiet for a moment, then Cormac Vane. May had been thinking the same name. Cormac Vane was a man who held land in the valley below the southern ridge and had been acquiring more of it steadily for several years, purchasing parcels from families who ran out of time and options, always within the boundaries of legality, always at the last possible moment when the selling family had no remaining choice. He had looked at the Callaway land claim according to Elias's careful notes in the back of the filing documents twice while Elias was alive. He had been told twice that it was not available. He had attended Elias's burial in Elk Creek with an expression of concern that May had noticed and filed away and not yet known what to do with. She knew what to do with it now. "He never comes himself," May said. "Not until he's certain." "He's testing the ground," Iris said. "Literally. He doesn't know where we are, but he knows we're up here somewhere." "He knows our father had something in the ridge," Iris said. "He's been trying to define it for years. He knows there's a claim. He doesn't know what the claim covers." May thought about the point, standing on the lower trail looking at the section of granite wall that contained the passage entrance with no expression on his face. "We need the letter to move faster," she said. "I know," said Iris. "There's nothing we can do to make it faster." That was the hardest part of what followed the waiting. May had been raised in a family where problems were addressed through action, and the particular difficulty of a problem that required waiting was one she had not fully encountered before. She could improve the entrance concealment. She could maintain her morning circuits. She could study the valley approaches and know the terrain better than anyone who might come up from below. But she could not make Edgar Finch read his mail faster. She could not make the wheels of the legal process turn at any speed other than their own. She worked instead. She split more wood from the deadfall she found in the section of forest above the ridge entrance. She reinforced the interior of the passage floor where one of the laid stones had shifted slightly. She traced the thermal seam further along the chamber wall and found 20 feet past where the basin was a second fissure where heat came through the granite in a way that made the air around it noticeably warmer, useful for June's growing area, which she mapped and expanded accordingly. She did what she could with what she had. She was learning the fundamental practice of the life they were building here. On the 19th day, Silas Webb came back early. May was on the upper ridge when she saw him below, not on the trail to the valley floor, but moving up along the base of the lower ridge, which was not his usual route and not the direction of any of his trap lines. She came down through the pine and met him at the flat rock at the bend in the creek, and she saw immediately from the way he held his hat that what he had to say was not good news. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I don't want any trouble from this." "Tell me," May said. He told her. Cormac Vane had come to see him 3 days ago. Not in a threatening way. Vane never did anything in a threatening way, which was one of the things that made him effective. He had come in the manner of a neighbor, asking after a neighbor, pleasant and indirect. And in the course of the conversation, he had asked whether Silas had seen any of the Calloway girls on his circuits recently, and whether he knew anything about a letter that had gone through Millhaven addressed to a lawyer named Finch. Silas had said he hadn't seen anything and didn't know anything about any letters, which was close enough to true that he'd been able to say it without his face giving him away. "But he knows," Silas said, "not where you are, but that you sent a letter, and he knows the lawyer's name." He turned his hat in his hands. Someone at the postal office talked, or someone saw the envelope. May stood very still on the flat rock at the bend in the creek and thought about Iris's careful formal handwriting on the outside of that envelope, the handwriting she had practiced to be nothing like her ordinary hand. She thought about how a piece of paper moving through a postal system was in the end a piece of paper moving through human hands, and human hands were not reliable in the ways that stone and timber and iron were reliable. "He's coming up," Silas said, "to the ridge. He told me he's going to walk the claim boundary. First light tomorrow or the day after." "Does he know how to find the entrance?" May asked. "I don't believe so, but he'll look." May looked at the mountains above her. She looked at the sky, which was moving toward evening in the particular way of the high country, fast, without ceremony, the warmth going out of the air between one breath and the next. "Thank you, Silas," she said. He nodded and put his hat back on. "Your father was a fair man," he said again. "He was," May said. She watched him go back down the trail. Then she sat on the flat rock for a moment alone and did the thing she allowed herself to do, rarely and briefly, and only when she was certain no one was watching. She put her face in her hands and she felt the full weight of it, the accumulated weight. Everything that had happened in the last 2 years pressing down at once the way it sometimes did when a specific new difficulty reminded the body of all the other difficulties it was already carrying. Her mother, her father, the house in Elk Creek, the country they had walked from one morning before dawn with everything they owned on their backs. She sat with it for 30 seconds. Then she took her hands away from her face and looked at the mountains and thought about what needed to be done. She went back up to the passage entrance, rolled the boulder aside, went through and told her sisters. Iris listened without interrupting. When May finished, Iris was quiet for the particular length of time she was quiet when she had already solved something and was organizing how to say it. "The letter channel is compromised," she said. "We can't use Silas for anything we don't want Vane to eventually know about." "Agreed. We need to register our occupancy directly," Iris said. "Not through Finch, not through any intermediary. I need to write to the county land office in person, or as close to in person as a letter can manage." She was already reaching for the journal. "And it has to go through a channel Vane doesn't know about. Which means one of us goes into Elk Creek," Iris said. "Not to the Elk Creek land office, but to the post there which routes directly to the county seat, not through Millhaven." She looked up. "I can write it tonight. Someone takes it down before dawn, drops it at the post, and is back before the town is moving." May thought about walking into Elk Creek, about the people there who had watched the Calloway girls with that particular expression of helpless concern that was she now understood also the expression of people who don't intend to help, but would rather not admit it to themselves. "I'll go," she said. "I know," said Iris. She went down the following morning before light. She dressed plainly work clothes, the kind that said nothing about who you were, except that you were someone who worked. She took the letter Iris had written that night in a third handwriting, now formal and deliberate, addressed to the county land office at the county seat, with full legal language, and their names and the claim number and the date of first occupancy stated precisely. She also took the small list of supplies Iris had compiled: cornmeal, a coil of wire, a tin of black powder, for waterproofing the boot leather that was beginning to show the effects of wet granite. She reached Elk Creek as the first real light was coming into the sky. The town was quiet in the way of a place not yet awake, a dog barking somewhere on the south end, the mill cold and dark, the single lamp burning in the window of the general store, where Orville Marsh opened early for trappers and miners coming in from the hills. She went directly to the store. Orville Marsh was behind the counter, not yet fully awake himself. He looked at May with the expression of a man who has registered her presence without yet deciding what it means. "Miss Calloway," he said, "haven't seen you in a while." "I've been busy," May said. She gave him the supply list. While he gathered the items, she went to the postal window at the back of the store, a wooden slot built into the wall with a locked box below it, and she put Iris's letter through the slot and listened to it fall into the box below. Done. "Where are you staying these days?" Orville Marsh asked when she came back to pay for the supplies. May counted out the coin. "With family," she said. It was the truth as far as it went, and it went far enough. She was back at the passage entrance before the town had fully woken. She rolled the boulder aside and went through and into the cabin, and she set the supplies on the shelf and put the coil of wire on its peg and sat down in the chair by the stove and let herself breathe. "Well," Iris said from the sleeping platform where she had apparently not slept. "It's sent," May said. Iris closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and sat up. "Good." They waited 5 more days. During those days, May improved the entrance concealment until she was satisfied, scattering debris at the base of the wall, redistributing the soil near the boulder, placing a growth of dried scrub pine against the stone face in a way that looked like it had grown there rather than been placed. She went over the surface of the ridge wall from outside, with her eye looking for anything that might read as human intervention. She found nothing after the 3rd day's work that satisfied her. June's first radishes came up on the 4th day. She didn't announce it. May came around the corner of the cabin to find June sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the soil ban, with her hands in her lap and the expression she had worn on the day they'd found the letter, looking at something small and green and improbably present in the dark, warm earth of the chamber floor. "There," June said quietly. "That row." May crouched beside her. 4 small shoots, pale and certain, pushing up from the soil with the absolute conviction of things that have decided to live. May looked at them for a long time. "Your mother's seeds?" she asked. "Both," June said. "They're both coming up." On the 5th day, Silas Webb came back a second time. Not along the valley trail, he came up through the southern approach, which was longer and less direct, and was the route May understood of someone who didn't want to be seen using the direct route. He had a letter. He handed it to May without ceremony, a sealed envelope with the county land office return on the back addressed to the Calloway sisters at General Delivery in Millhaven, which was where Iris had directed Finch to send any response. Finch had received Iris's original letter and forwarded the formal occupancy registration himself, apparently to the county seat with his own certification attached, because Edgar Finch was a thorough man and a Calloway was a name he associated with fair dealing. May took the letter through the passage and set it on the table and didn't open it. She waited until Iris and June were both standing there. Then she pushed it across the table to Iris because it was Iris's work that had made it happen. Iris opened it, read it again, then looked up with an expression May had not seen on her face in more than a year. Not quite happiness, not quite relief, something more durable than either. "It's filed," Iris said. "The occupancy registration. All 3 names, dated from the day we entered the chamber." She set the letter down. "It predates anything Vane has filed or could file. The county has our names on record as holders of an occupied property with documented prior claim. He has no legal ground." The chamber was quiet. The water dripped. Somewhere along the warm wall, June's radishes were doing their slow, certain work. "He doesn't know that yet," May said. "No," Iris agreed, "but he will." That night, Silas brought one more piece of information delivered at the valley floor at dusk. Without ceremony, Cormac Vane would come up the ridge to the following morning. First light, he would bring a witness, a man named Rupert Aldine, who worked as a surveyor for the county and occasionally for private parties. May walked back up to the chamber alone, through the last of the evening light, through the scrub pine and the loose stone, and the approach she could now navigate without looking at her feet. She went through the passage. She let the canvas fall close behind her. She stood in the chamber in the dark. The fissures above showed only a deep gray. No light left in the sky above them, and she listened to the mountain, the drip of water, the faint pop of the stove ticking down to coals. Her sisters' voices from inside the cabin, low and wordless, from where she stood, just the sound of them, the particular sound of 2 people she loved moving through the world in the next room. She walked to the passage entrance and put her back against the stone wall beside it. She slid down until she was sitting on the leveled floor stones, the ones her father had fitted and laid so that someone walking through in the dark would not stumble. She sat there and did not try to solve anything. She had spent 2 years solving things, and she was good at it, and tonight there was nothing to solve that had not already been solved as well as it could be. The papers were filed, the entrance was concealed, the occupation was real and documented and dated. The rest of it was tomorrow's work. She thought about her father. She thought about him sitting somewhere in this passage in the years before she knew this place existed, sitting in the dark with the smell of granite and timber around him, thinking about his daughters. Thinking about May, who was too much like him to ask for help from anyone. Thinking about Iris, who would always find the pattern in anything if you gave her enough time to look. Thinking about June, who would put her hands in the soil of a granite chamber and trust that something would grow. He had known them. He had known them better than she had understood while he was alive to know them. And he had built this place around the specific shapes of who they were, not a generic shelter, but a shelter fitted to them the way a good joint is fitted to the specific pieces of wood it connects. May pressed her palms flat against the stone on either side of her, cold granite, old, patient. Her father's chisel marks were around the corner at the basin, but his hands had been here too. On every stone in this passage he had been present. Tomorrow Cormac Vane would come, and she would show him what Elias Calloway had built, and she would let the truth of it speak for itself. She was ready. She closed her eyes and listened to the mountain, and the mountain was quiet and the water dripped, and somewhere in the warm, dark earth of the chamber floor, seeds that her mother had saved and her father had learned to tend were doing what seeds do in the patient, irreversible way of things that have already decided what they are going to become. The morning came into the chamber the way it always did, not all at once, but in pieces. First, the fissures above showed a change in quality rather than color, the black becoming something less absolute, a dark that was beginning to consider alternatives. Then the first gray thin and uncommitted falling in columns that were more suggestion than light. Then slowly the pale blue-white that belonged specifically to this place, this chamber, this particular arrangement of stone and sky and the thin passages that connected them. May had not slept. She had come back inside from the passage sometime after midnight, banked the stove and lain on the sleeping platform, with her eyes open in the dark, listening to her sisters breathe. Not anxious exactly, she had moved past anxiety somewhere in the third hour of sitting in the passage, moved through it, and out the other side into something quieter and more fundamental. Not peace, she would not call it peace. More like the particular stillness of a person who has accepted the full weight of what the day is going to require and has decided they are equal to it. She rose before the light was fully in the chamber and built the fire up from coals, working quietly so as not to wake her sisters. She put the coffee on. She swept the cabin floor, which did not need sweeping because it was something to do with her hands, while she waited for the rest of the household to come awake, and May had learned long ago that idle hands in the morning made the mind louder than it needed to be. She went outside into the chamber and walked its perimeter slowly the way she had walked it every morning, looking at the space the way a stranger might look at it, trying to see what Cormac Vane would see when he stepped through the passage, trying to assess it without the familiarity that had accumulated over 3 weeks of living here. What she saw was a chamber that looked inhabited, not roughly, not desperately, but deliberately. The cabin against the far wall, its proportions careful, its timber fitted with the precision of someone who built things to last. The stovepipe rising to the fissure above. The canvas curtain at the window, her father's curtain hung on her father's nails by her hands. The stone basin with its steady trickle of warm water. The long band of soil along the heated wall, no longer raw and tended, but growing the first shoots of several varieties, already several inches tall. The rows marked by June's flat stones with their careful notched identifications. It looked like a home, not a temporary shelter, not a desperate refuge. A home built with care, inhabited with intention, shaped over time by people who understood what they had and treated it accordingly. Good May thought, let him see exactly that. She went back inside when she heard Iris moving. Iris was already at the table when May came through the cabin door, the claim documents spread before her in the arrangement she had settled on after 3 revisions. Not dramatic, not theatrical, simply clear. The original filing on top, the occupancy amendment below it, And slightly to the right, Edgar Finch's certification letter, at the bottom of the column, the county registration confirmation on the left. Every date visible, every signature facing forward. She was dressed as she always dressed, practically without vanity, in the way of someone who understood that how a person presents themselves communicates either competence or its absence, and who had decided a long time ago which one she intended to communicate. "How long do we have?" she asked without looking up from her final check of the documents. "An hour," May said. "Maybe less. He'll come at first light, and first light is close." Iris nodded and made a small adjustment to the position of Finch's letter. June came from the sleeping platform already dressed, her hair braided back, moving with the purposeful quiet of someone who has been awake for a while and thinking. She went directly out of the cabin and around its corner to the soil ban without speaking. May followed her out and stood at the cabin corner and watched. June moved along the rows with a small tin cup of water from the basin, watering each section with the unhurried attention she always gave this work, not perfunctory, not rushed, genuinely attending to each plant as its own thing with its own particular needs. The radish shoots were the tallest, nearly 4 inches, now their color in the morning light, a green so vivid it seemed almost argumentative against the gray stone. The hardy greens were coming up in a denser pattern, lower and broader. The herbs were slowest, but present, small, and certain. June finished the watering and crouched at the end of the longest row. She removed one small weed, a single thread of something pale that had found its way up through the soil near the radishes, and held it for a moment before setting it aside. Then she stood and turned and looked at May. "We're ready," she said. May looked at her youngest sister in the morning light of the chamber, at the soil on her hands and the steadiness in her face, and the absolute unperformed certainty of those 2 words. "Yes," May said, "we are to, They heard Vane at the boulder before they saw him. May had gone out through the passage alone, which they had agreed on, and was standing in the cold open air of the ridge when she heard the approach from below. 2 sets of footsteps, deliberate, moving up through the scrub pine with the particular cadence of men who are accustomed to walking in the mountains, but who are not doing so at speed because they are not men who hurry. Cormac Vane did not hurry. Hurrying communicated need, and Vane was a man who had built his position largely on the appearance of never needing anything. She heard them before she saw them. Then she saw them emerge from the tree line below the ridge. Vane. First, a large man, broad across the shoulders, wearing good boots, and the expression he had worn at her father's burial, concerned, attentive, already decided. Behind him, slightly shorter, with the compact, precise movements of a man accustomed to working in rough terrain, Rupert Aldine. He carried a leather satchel in the look of someone performing a professional function rather than a personal one. May stood at the base of the concealed entrance and waited for them to come to her. She did not go down to meet them. She had thought about this. The instinct was to go down to be welcoming, to reduce the tension of the moment by moving toward it. But her father had taught her in his indirect way that a person who goes down to meet a challenge on someone else's ground has already given up something. She stood on her own ground and let Vane climb to her. He arrived at the base of the ridge face and looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected something other than this, a young woman standing calmly in the cold morning, neither welcoming nor defensive, simply present. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was warm in the way that voices are warm when warmth has been calculated to serve a purpose. "I appreciate you meeting me here. I understand you have been settled somewhere on the ridge. I'd like to understand the extent of your father's claim, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," May said. "Come in." She watched the slight shift in his expression. That was the second time in this conversation that he had encountered something other than what he had prepared for, and she saw him adjust quickly the way a man of his experience adjusts. He was good at adjusting. She would need to remember that. She turned to the boulder and put her hands on it and rolled it aside with the practiced motion of someone who has done this every day for 3 weeks. Because she had. She did not perform the motion, did not dramatize it. She simply moved the boulder in the way you move something that belongs to you and that you have moved 100 times. "This is mine. This is familiar. This is ordinary to me." She went through the passage first, and she heard them follow Vane's breath, catching slightly at the narrowness of it. Aldine silent and professional behind him. The moment Cormac Vane stepped out of the passage and into the chamber was a moment May had prepared for, and yet could not fully have anticipated because she could not have anticipated exactly how his face would look when the space opened around him. He stopped walking. That was the first thing. He simply stopped in the way that a body stops when the information coming into it exceeds what it was prepared to process. He stood in the chamber and he looked. He looked at the ceiling fissures, at the columns of morning light falling across the stone floor, at the scale of the space, which was not enormous, but which was so completely improbable given the solid granite that surrounded it, that the scale felt larger than it was. He looked at the cabin against the far wall, its proportions settled and sure, its stovepipe rising to disappear into the stone. He looked at the basin with its steady thin trickle. He looked at the long band of green along the warm wall. Rupert Aldine had come out of the passage behind him and also stopped. He stood slightly to Vane's left, and May, watching them both, saw on Aldine's face something different from what was on Vane's. Vane's expression was the expression of a man recalculating. Aldine's expression was the expression of a man recognizing something. The morning light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside, and the columns shifted, and the whole chamber shifted with them the way a room shifts when the light in it changes, becoming for a moment a slightly different version of itself. No one spoke. May let them stand in it. She did not fill the silence. Her father had understood that silence used correctly was not an absence of communication but a form of it, and that a person who rushes to fill silence is a person who has not yet understood what the silence is doing. Vane spoke first. "Your father built this," he said. Not a question. "Yes," May said. He walked forward into the chamber. Slowly, the way you walk into a place that is not yours when you are trying to understand it without revealing that you are trying to understand it. He walked to the water basin and looked at it. He looked at the chisel marks around it without touching them. Then he walked to the cabin doorway and looked at the floor inside the plank floor level and fitted the joinery of the walls the stove with its careful installation. He was a man who understood construction. May had known this and had counted on it. A man who did not understand construction might have looked at this place and seen only its strangeness. Vane understood construction, which meant he understood exactly what he was looking at: years, hundreds of hours, a level of care and intention that was not compatible with any story except one. He turned from the cabin doorway and looked at May. "How long?" he asked. "He filed the original claim in 1881, May said. "He began work here around the same time. He amended the filing in 1886 to include the occupied structure." She kept her voice level, informational, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than arguing them. "We have been in residence since the 4th of this month." Vane looked at the chamber again. He looked at it the way he had looked at her father's face at the burial, with the expression of a man who has encountered something he cannot absorb into his existing account of the world without revising the account. Iris came to the cabin doorway. She walked across the chamber floor with the documents in her hands, not hurrying, not performing, simply moving from one point to another with the deliberate calm of someone who has already done every difficult thing the situation required and is now doing the last easiest one. She offered the papers to Vane. "The filed claim and the occupancy registration," she said, "dated the 4th. All three of us are named as holders. The circuit lawyer's certification is on the second page. The county registration confirmation is at the bottom." Vane took the documents. He read them with the expression of a man who had been hoping to find a different document and found himself holding the correct one. He read them thoroughly, which May had expected. He was not a man who accepted defeat on the basis of a quick scan. He read every line. He looked at every date. He looked at Edgar Finch's signature and at the county registrar's stamp and at the 3 names written in Iris's clear, unhurried hand above the date. He turned to the second page. He read it. Then he was still for a moment, and in that stillness, Rupert Aldine spoke for the first time. "Vane," Aldine said. His voice was careful, professional, carrying the particular weight of someone and about to say something the other person will not want to hear. Vane looked at him. Aldine opened his leather satchel and removed a folded document. He unfolded it slowly and looked at it, and May watched his face as he read it, the face of a man who was confirming what he already suspected. "I surveyed this section of the ridge," Aldine said, "for the county in the spring of 1882. The chamber was very quiet. I remember it because it was unusual terrain," Aldine continued. He was looking at the document in his hands, not at Vane. Northeast Granite Formation, significant chamber behind the face. I noted it in my report. He paused. I noted signs of human modification. The floor of the chamber had been partially worked. There was evidence of recent timber activity. He looked up. I noted it as origin and purpose unclear. I didn't pursue it further because it wasn't within the scope of my survey. He refolded the document and looked at May for the first time. Your father was working here before 1882, he said. Not an accusation, a statement of record. Yes, May said. Aldine looked at Vane. The modification I noted in my county survey predates any claim you could file or any challenge you could make, he said. It's in the county record. I wrote it myself. He paused again. The occupancy has documentary support from an independent government source dated 7 years before these women arrived here. The columns of light moved again across the stone floor. Cormac Vane stood in the chamber with the documents in his hands and the evidence of Elias Calloway's work surrounding him on every side. The floor, the walls, the fitted timber, the basin with its patient trickle, and May watched him understand piece by piece that he had not simply brought the wrong documents. He had brought the wrong man. The witness he had brought to support his challenge had in the space of 2 minutes become the final piece of evidence against it. Vane was a man who had built his life on a particular kind of intelligence, the intelligence of knowing when a position was tenable and when it was not, and moving accordingly. It was the same intelligence that had allowed him to acquire what he had acquired without ever quite crossing a line that could be held against him in a court. May had understood this about him, and she had been relying on it now that his intelligence would tell him in this chamber on this morning that what he was looking at was not a position he could take. He looked at the documents one more time. Then he looked at the chamber, at the whole of it, slowly from the passage entrance to the cabin, to the basin, to the green rose along the far wall. May saw the moment he was done. It did not announce itself dramatically. It was simply a small change in his posture, a fraction of relaxation, the particular loosening of a man who has put down something heavy, even if what he was putting down was an intention rather than a physical weight. He held the documents out to Iris. The claim appears to be in order, he said. His voice was what it had always been, warm, measured, carrying nothing in it that could be quoted or held against him. He was not apologizing. He was not conceding in any way he could not immediately walk back if the circumstances changed. He was simply acknowledging a fact the way a man of his particular intelligence acknowledges facts, precisely without elaboration, and with the understanding that acknowledgement is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as defeat. But he was walking away. Iris took the documents from him without expression. She held them at her side. "Thank you for coming up," May said. Vane looked at her for a moment. She had the feeling, not for the first time, that he was revising something, his assessment of what these three women were, what they represented, what they were capable of. She let him revise it. She was not interested in what he thought of them. She was interested in the fact that he was leaving. He turned. He walked to the passage entrance. Aldine followed him, replacing the survey document in his satchel with the careful motions of a professional completing a task. At the entrance to the passage, Vane paused without turning around. He did not say anything. Then he went through. May listened to the sound of them moving through the passage, the scrape of Vane's coat against the stone, the more careful progress of Aldine's satchel, navigating the narrow space. Then silence from the passage. Then, distant and growing more distant, the sound of boots on granite outside. She waited. She counted to 60 slowly. Then she walked to the passage and looked through it, the slit of gray morning light at the far end empty. The boulder uncovered the approach clear. She stood there for a moment longer, making sure. Then she rolled the boulder into place from inside. The sound it made as it settled against the stone, a low, certain sound. The sound of something solid returning to where it belonged, filled the chamber briefly, and then was absorbed by the granite and the air and the patient depth of the mountain around them. May turned around. June was sitting cross-legged on the chamber floor in front of the growing wall, doing what she had been doing when May had gone out to meet Vane, attending to the plants. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm in the way of someone for whom the work in front of them is real and present and more important than the drama happening at the periphery. She was removing a weed from between two rows, a single thin, pale thing that had found its way up through the soil near the radishes. and she was doing it with the focused attention of someone doing important work, which it was. Iris was at the cabin doorway with the documents in her hand. She looked at May across the width of the chamber. May looked back at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Iris went inside and set the documents on the shelf, not on the table anymore, where they had been positioned for display. On the shelf with the other things that belonged here, the things that were part of the ordinary ongoing life of this place. May crossed the chamber and sat down on the stone floor beside June. She sat the way June was sitting, cross-legged, hands on her knees facing the growing wall, not doing anything in particular, just being there in the chamber in the morning with her sister. June pulled the last weed and set it aside and looked at her rose. "The radishes are going to be ready soon," she said. 2 weeks, maybe a little more." "How do you know?" May asked. "The way they look," June said. "There's a kind of confidence in them." She said it without self-consciousness, as though confidence were a quality as observable in radishes as in people, which May thought it might be. They sat quietly for a moment. The water dripped. From inside the cabin came the small sound of Iris writing the particular rhythm of her pen on paper, which was a sound May had known since she was old enough to know sounds. "He knew," June said, not a question. "Yes," May said. "He knew it might come to something like that." June was looking at the plants. "He knew someone might come up here and try to take it. That's why he filed the papers the way he did. That's why he built everything the way he did." She paused. "He built it to survive being challenged." "Yes," May said again. June turned and looked at her sister. Her face was open in the way it was always open, not naive, not unguarded, but simply present, fully there, not protecting itself with distance the way May sometimes protected herself. "You're not going to fall apart," June said. "I know you think you can't, but you don't have to hold yourself that tightly anymore." May looked at her youngest sister on the stone floor of a granite chamber in the Montana mountains in the morning light that came through the fissures above them, and felt something shift in her chest in a way that she recognized and that she had been managing for a long time. "I know," May said. June reached over and put her hand on May's arm briefly, the way she sometimes touched things she wanted to memorize. Then she turned back to her plants. May climbed to the top of the ridge that afternoon. She had not done it before, had not gone above the entrance, had not climbed to the actual crest of the ridge wall that contained the chamber. She had stayed at the level of the passage entrance, moving laterally, understanding the approaches. She had not gone up. She went up now. The climb was steep and required both hands for sections of it, working through the granite outcroppings above the main face, finding holds in the stone that the mountain provided grudgingly and at intervals. It took her 30 minutes to reach the crest. She was breathing hard when she got there, and she sat down on the flat top of the ridge wall with her legs over the far side and looked out at what her father had seen from here. The valley below was white and floor flat, the creek running through it, a thin silver line in the afternoon light. Elk Creek itself was visible at the far end, small, orderly, organized around its mill. In its main street, the buildings she had grown up around, reduced by distance to geometry, simple shapes on the valley floor. She could see moving along the valley road below 2 figures. Vane and Aldine, small as the town was small, from here walking in the direction of the lower country. Already past the tree line. Already in every practical sense gone. She watched them until they were too small to follow, and then she watched the valley for a while longer, because the valley was beautiful from here. In a way it had never been beautiful from within it, the mountains rising on every side, the sky enormous and moving, the creek catching light in the low afternoon sun. Her father had sat here. She was sure of it. He had climbed to this same crest on his visits before the cabin was finished, perhaps while it was being built, and he had sat and looked down at the valley and at Elk Creek and thought about his daughters, who were down there going about their lives, unaware of what he was building above them. She thought about